Way back in the early days of the Savage Books channel, and I mean way back when my content looked like this, I uploaded a 7.5-minute video talking about the dark aspects of Disney movies. Across that video, I made mention of the writing techniques and practices that were necessary to properly marry animation targeted to children with adult themes like death or racism. And at the end of the video, I had said that in order to craft cartoons that both kids and adults could enjoy, the narrative needed to be centered on simple issues that even children could get behind, while carefully interweaving a subtle backdrop of real struggle that adults could be engaged with too. This fine line of balancing innocent and mature themes is a necessary duality for animation to keep in check. But then I also said that if you were making Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, you could disregard all that and throw the rulebook out the window. That video was uploaded over 18 months ago, and believe it or not, ever since then, I have been wanting to dive into what makes Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island so unique. And across the year and a half that I've been sitting on this idea, my interests and curiosities have changed and grown. Now, I find myself wanting to investigate and unpack the writing behind a bunch of really dark animated movies, not only because I think I would have a lot of fun with it, but I think all of you could scratch that nostalgia itch while also learning about what narrative and writing decisions went into making those dark animated movies you love so much. Sometimes the best inspiration that a writer can get is from learning how their favorite stories came to be. This Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island video will be the first entry in the prospective series Throwback Breakdown, and if you guys like this, I will definitely dive into other movies like El Dorado and Atlantis and others. But for the here and now, we are going to focus on the Mystery Gang and their crazy adventure through Moonscar Island. But to do that, we have to establish some context for the film, and that can only be found in the late 20th century.
Live from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, it's the 16th annual Daytime Emmy Awards.
1989 was a great year for Scooby-Doo. Not only was it the 20th anniversary of the franchise, it was also the year it received its first Emmy nomination. A pup named Scooby-Doo, which was basically an adorable reskin of the Scooby-Doo Where Are You series, stood in the running to receive the award for Outstanding Daytime Animated Children's Programming. Young Scooby and the Mystery Gang stayed a strong presence on daytime television, earning 2 Emmy nominations across a 4-year run. However, 1991 was the last year of the show, and due to Scooby thereafter being absent from Saturday morning lineups, the franchise started to see diminishing returns. It's hard to keep kids invested in a series that they aren't able to watch. But 1991, while seeming like the beginning of the end for Scooby-Doo, was really the start of something monumental. 1991 was the year that Turner Broadcasting purchased Hanna-Barbera, the animation studio behind Scooby-Doo. And the reason Turner Broadcasting did this is because they were conducting a bit of an experiment. The company was looking to make a 24/7 cable channel centered on animation, something that had never been done before and at the time was considered revolutionary and generally inadvisable. Primetime watching hours for children, who were, the main consumers of animation, were between 8 and 10 p.m. on weekdays and before noon on weekends. Why would a channel ever run cartoons for 18 hours a day outside of its target window? This concern was not overlooked by Turner Broadcasting, and they moved forward with tempered expectations. Terrence F. McGuirk, the executive vice president of Turner Broadcasting, said the company had realistic expectations that the prospective channel's growth would be modest for some time. Ted Turner, the chairman and namesake for Turner Broadcasting, largely agreed and expected a very slow growth for the 24/7 animation channel, considering it a long-term play. Not everyone was so reserved though. One of the most excited responses came from Scott Sassa, the president of Turner Entertainment. He said, "We perceive the addition of Hanna-Barbera as parallel in some ways to our acquisition of MGM. We got some terrific gems then, like Gone with the Wind and Casablanca. With this deal, we're getting gems like the Flintstones, the Jetsons, and Scooby-Doo." Now, I think you all can agree that is some very high praise. But Scott Sassa might have been right on the money, because that experimental animation-focused channel was Cartoon Network. Yeah, that one. By 1994, only 2 years after its launch, Cartoon Network became the 5th most popular cable channel in the United States, blowing expectations out of the water, and a lot of that was owed to Scooby-Doo. In the early years of Cartoon Network, the Mystery Gang was on the channel a lot. Part of that was out of necessity, as Cartoon Network's library of usable television shows was limited. Another reason was that people just wanted to see Scooby-Doo. After its long absence from Saturday morning lineups, the return of Scooby-Doo, even if reruns, spiked Cartoon Network's ratings, causing people to sit down and tune in. When network executive Linda Semensky was asked about the constant running of Scooby-Doo on the channel, she said they'd keep showing it as long as the ratings were good. Those high ratings persisted and caught the attention of Warner Bros., who eventually merged with Turner Network. Wanting to capitalize on the popularity of Scooby-Doo, Warner Bros. Directed the Hanna-Barbera studio to create a direct-to-DVD Scooby-Doo project. And thus, the seeds of Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island were planted. All that was left was to build a team to water those seeds to blossom.
Once upon a time, our development crew, led by Davis Doy, was told, you're making Scooby-Doo movies. They're going to be hour long. And you're going to, you'll get a writer. And Davis said, well, let's use Glenn because we've worked with him before and he's written Scooby-Doo. There was the quote-unquote brain trust of this thing. There was Davis, of course, Glenn, Jim Stenstrom, who'd be the head designer, and myself.
That was Lance Falk, writer and designer for multiple Scooby-Doo projects. The brain trust that he spoke of was a team of Hanna-Barbera animation veterans. Chosen director and designer Jim Stenstrom had been working with Hanna-Barbera since the early 80s and had worked on the Emmy-nominated A Pup Named Scooby-Doo. Glenn Leopold and Davis Doy, both of whom had received Emmy nominations in 1994, were also brought on to write the script. And as previously mentioned, Lance Falk would be working with them as well. Now, by being part of this chosen group, each of these gentlemen were given a unique opportunity when it comes to television. Due to the fact that Warner Bros. Wanted the Scooby-Doo project to go straight to DVD, they weren't too concerned with the contents of the creation, meaning that the team got nearly complete creative freedom when writing the movie. With 4 big names working alongside each other, this freedom led to competing ideas about what this project should be. Director Jim Stenstrom came forward with a rather radical idea at the time. He proposed that whatever the movie be, it contain real monsters. He wanted to make the most out of the animation and not be limited by only what a masked human villain could accomplish. Jim also wanted to use the opportunity to shake up the formula of what Scooby-Doo had so consistently and predictably been. Writer Glenn Leopold was very much not on board with this idea. Listen to Lance Falk talk about it.
And Glenn says, no. Scooby-Doo is a solvable mystery where the audience solves it. It's always been that way. That's the premise of the show. That's what it is. We need to do that. We're just doing it longer.
Davis Doy then spoke up about his own concerns, mainly with the writing.
And Davis said, the thing is about that is you can do that for 22 minutes. But if you do it for 70 minutes and you're yanking people around for 70 minutes and it turns out to be a fake, first of all, it's really difficult to hide that, the resolution for that long. And the other thing is, it's kind of unsatisfying to do an entire movie where it's a guy in a rubber mask.
In my assessment, Davis Doy had some pretty valid critiques based in the execution of the writing. The typical 22-minute Scooby-Doo runtime was the perfect length to set up the conflict, the monster, the chase, and the reveal, all while keeping the audience interested. Of course, everyone watching already knew that the gang would unmask the monster and prevail in the end, but that really wasn't the point of the show. It was seeing all the clues and wacky hijinks that led to the unmasking. But a 70-minute movie was an entirely different animal and demanded different writing considerations as such. So the team was caught in a bit of a bind when conceptualizing what the movie would be. On one side, you had Glenn Leopold, a man who had been writing for Scooby-Doo for nearly 20 years, saying that the traditions of the show needed to be upheld. On the other side was Davis Doy and Jim Stenstrom, Hanna-Barbera heavy hitters in their own right, saying that the monsters should be real. it took designer Lance Falk chiming in with his own idea for any headway to be made.
And I was the guy who said, and this is my one significant contribution, but I think it's a really great one, is I said we need to do both then. So we need to have, definitely in the body of the story, we need to have a solvable mystery and unmask and do all the Scooby-Doo stuff, but we also need real monsters woven into the story in some fashion so that we can fill it out, but also to make the stories more sophisticated, because we can have clues leading to one thing, but they're really about the other thing. And so you can do all these little back and forth cross things. And as soon as I said that, everyone was like, yeah, that's it. That's what we do.
Lance Falk's comment about story sophistication is really important in understanding why Zombie Island stood out from other Scooby-Doo mysteries before it. See, contrary to Glenn Leopold's purist beliefs, Scooby-Doo had very much included real monsters in its storylines before. The 1980 series Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo included the likes of aliens and vampires, not people in masks, but real supernatural forces. However, Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy never attempt an unmasking, and never really even comment on how strange it is to encounter real monsters. And that distinction is what makes Zombie Island special. The previous real monsters in the series weren't taken seriously, which means that the implications of their existence didn't need to be taken seriously either. I mean, there is a literal shape-shifting vampire in Scooby-Doo, which would normally beg the question, how did it come to be, and are there others? But curiosities like that are ignored for the wackiness of it all. Zombie Island takes those deep questions surrounding the monsters and puts them at center stage. Previous Scooby-Doo movies or episodes would have glossed over or completely ignored the details of these monsters. But Lance Falk's idea of using both a solvable mystery and real monsters allowed for a jarringly intense look at what a genuine supernatural enemy would be. But all of that was still just the conceptual basis of the film. Figuring out an actual story to put on top of it was a whole other task entirely. And of course, if you're watching this video, you already know that the story that they chose was the mystery gang battling against pagans who sold their souls to a feline god in order to become werecats that could suck the life force out of victims in exchange for immortality. Not exactly the most straightforward narrative. In fact, I would say that it's the most imaginative Scooby-Doo script ever written. But I know what you're thinking. How in the world did they decide on all that? Well, it actually makes a lot more sense than you might think. But to get there, we have to talk about two other cartoons first, SWAT Kats and Jonny Quest. Hanna-Barbera, while most famously remembered for the likes of Scooby-Doo and the Jetsons, had many other cartoons under its belt too, one of which was the action-adventure show SWAT Kats: The Radical Squadron. But SWAT Kats really wasn't just any other show. By 1994, literally only its second year of airing, SWAT Kats became the #1 syndicated cartoon in America. The show was so popular that Hanna-Barbera wanted to make it a focus of their programming, planning to release merchandise, posters, and episodes through the rest of the 90s. But that, unfortunately, never happened. You see, Ted Turner, the chairman of Turner Entertainment, the one we talked about before, was displeased with SWAT Kats, specifically the violence in the show. At one point, he even addressed the US Congress about the issue. Listen to the SWAT Kats creators talk about it.
Back in 1994, a lot of you guys are young, you don't recall, but there was a big movement, a lot of it parents against violence in TV. And they had a lot of say about what's going on, to a point where the big broadcasters, the head of the big broadcasters went into the Senate, big committee, and they were saying, well, we don't do violent show, you know, like the big networks and stuff like that. And Ted Turner, being kind of an outsider, he said, you know, well, we're not gonna be making violent show. We were making SWAT Kats at the same time.
Shortly after Ted Turner made his feelings known, SWAT Kats was cancelled. And it was cancelled so quickly that whole episodes had been written but never voiced, animated, or aired. And just like that, the #1 rated cartoon in the world and all the people who worked on it had the rug completely swept out from under them. But that actually brings us to Jonny Quest and the 1996 episode Eclipse. The setting was based in New Orleans, and the villain that the Quest gang was facing was a woman named Elise Lenoir. At the climax of the episode, it was revealed that Miss Lenoir was actually a succubus that would drain the life force of others during a lunar eclipse in order to retain her youth and immortality. And if that sounds familiar, yes, that is just the plot of Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, which would release 2 years later in 1998.
I am Elise Lenoir.
Hi.
So, Miss Lenoir, is your house really
Haunted? Yes.
Or rather, I should say it is part of the plot. Let's rewind a bit to break all this down. So, remember how I said that SWAT Kats was abruptly cancelled, leaving episodes written but unaired? One of those episodes was called Succubus, also known as The Curse of Cataluna. The titular character of the episode was a succubus cat named Katrina Moorcroft. With the help of her assistants, she would lure the unsuspecting to her mansion, where she would steal their life force in order to maintain immortality, sometimes even under a full moon. Aren't you getting deja vu yet? If so, that's good, it means you're paying attention. That unaired SWAT Kats episode is almost a one-to-one clone of the Jonny Quest episode, Eclipse. But why? Well, the two head developers on SWAT Kats were Davis Doi and Glenn Leopold. With Hanna-Barbera being the close-knit studio that it is, both those men were also on the creative team for Jonny Quest, alongside writer Lance Falk. Hopefully now the puzzle pieces are starting to fall into place. Glenn Leopold and Davis Doi took the unused succubus script from SWAT Kats and brought it to life through the world of Jonny Quest. And then when Lance Falk joined Glenn Leopold and Davis Doi on the proposed straight-to-DVD Scooby-Doo project, the three merged the SWAT Kats script and the Jonny Quest script into what became Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. There is a delicious, nearly poetic irony about all of this too. Glenn Leopold and Davis Doi's show SWAT Kats was cancelled for being too violent. Ted Turner and the other studio executives feared what violent and gruesome cartoons would do to their viewing audience, and ultimately their bottom lines. But when Warner Bros. Came calling to Glenn Leopold and Davis Doi years later, giving them complete creative freedom for the Scooby-Doo project, they took one of those SWAT Kats episodes that was quote-unquote too violent for cartoons, ramped up the intensity to 11, and then made the best Scooby-Doo movie of the decade, maybe of all time. Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island wasn't just a random movie with werecats, zombies, and ghosts. It was a story that the creators had been sitting on for years, a story that at one point was deemed too brutal to even be successful, and a story written for a completely different fictional world, but one that somehow still managed to work beautifully. Zombie Island's unflinching look at real horror and violence and fear is its strength, not its weakness. The creative freedom given to the team to explore real conflict is what makes the events of the narrative and its climax so compelling.
You know, I think it was cool that it was a little scary. You know, kids like that. They're fine with that. You know, as long as we're not being too explicit or horrific about it. So that's what you get when you have good artists who work well together without a lot of interference. You get Zombie Island.
When Zombie Island first released, LA Times reviewer Lynn Heffley wrote, "It's more entertaining than you'd think, despite the familiar Saturday morning type animation. The hook this time? The zombies, ghosts, and sharp-toothed monsters are real. Warning, some of the cartoon gruesomeness is too intense for young viewers." Now, while I agree with Lynn Heffley's assessment on some level, I think the hook of the film was so much more than monsters being real. I think that the true hook of Zombie Island, what made it so alluring, was what the reality of the monsters meant for the stories and messages that a Scooby-Doo movie could tell. Here's what I mean. Scooby-Doo, for decades, had been exactly what Glenn Leopold had described it as, a solvable mystery. There was a tradition amongst the show of what to expect every single time these characters came on screen. Fred would lead the gang, Velma would lose her glasses, Daphne would be the damsel in distress, Shaggy and Scooby would bumble about, and the villain would be unmasked to the tune of,
"Might have gotten away with it too. It
wasn't for these meddling kids. Meddling kids. Meddling kids.
Sure, all cartoons have a bit of a formula they follow. That is just the nature of 22-minute syndicated storytelling. But Scooby-Doo's formula became part of its identity. So Zombie Island, in effect, wasn't just a simple tweak of the formula. It was an alteration of Scooby-Doo's DNA, one that was somehow an homage, a parody, and an evolution of classic Scooby-Doo. The homage comes from the way it structures itself just like classic Scooby-Doo. You have the introduction of a mystery, the suspicious unsavory characters that ultimately turn out to be innocent, wacky chase scenes, and the innocent characters that turn out to be behind all of the mayhem. The parody comes from the recognition of this formula and how the monsters are always just men in masks.
You know, the real reason I changed jobs was because the monsters and ghosts always turned out to be bad guys in a mask.
Got a little boring, eh?
No kidding.
The movie literally has an entire parody song about it. But the evolution comes from all those things that Zombie Island does differently. Fred doesn't really lead the gang. Velma doesn't lose her glasses. Daphne can defend herself. Shaggy and Scooby find and thwart the villains. And of course, the monsters are actually real. Part of the reason Zombie Island comes off as so good is its ability to walk this tightrope of tradition, subversion, and evolution. And I fully believe that properly performing all of these narrative gymnastics was only possible because the four main creators of Zombie Island had a deep love of what Scooby-Doo stood for, but also a deep desire to produce what Scooby-Doo needed to be. And that brings us to the last big point of this video, the writing of Zombie Island's characters. Throughout the story of Scooby-Doo, the show's characters had traditionally been flat. This is simply a literary term to mark characters that are uncomplicated, with only a few defining traits or motivations that are easy to understand. Again, a large reason for this was the short 22-minute runtime of the syndicated show. The Mystery Gang was good, and the men in masks were greedy and bad, and that's all you needed to know. Why exactly were the villains doing bad things? Because they were bad. Why are you making this complicated? There wasn't much time to include many more details than that. Scooby-Doo was very much a you get what you see type show, where the only big reveal came by way of unmasking. To me, this is Zombie Island's biggest departure from classic Scooby-Doo, as it moves away from using simple flat characters to using round characters, characters with complexity, depth, and context to their actions. But the truly genius move was that this character evolution was not focused on Scooby or the other protagonist. It was focused on the antagonists. There are many people out there, myself included, who believe that the antagonist is the most important character in a story. The reason for this, at least speaking for myself, is not that I like to see evil people doing evil things. It's because of what the antagonist represents in a story on a functional level. A guiding principle of writing is that a story can only be as compelling as the conflict that the protagonist must overcome. That conflict, though, is completely dependent on the antagonist. That is their narrative function in a story. An antagonist is meant to embody the struggle that the protagonist must surmount. So, by definition, the more interesting, fleshed out, and effective the antagonist is, the more engaging the conflict will be, which ultimately leads to how entertaining a story as a whole will be. The zombies in Zombie Island could have very easily just been malevolent spirits who wanted to haunt the island. Lena, Simone, and Jacques could have easily been mustache-twirling stereotype villains. But none of this happened. The creative team behind the movie decided to give these characters a complex background and a reason for their actions. The zombies were tortured souls who had lost their lives to sorcery, doing everything they could to keep others from succumbing to a similar fate. It went even further with Lena and Simone. They were settlers who saw their friends and family massacred by pirates and fed to gators. They sold their souls to a pagan deity out of heartbreak, in order to take vengeance on the pirates that had destroyed their lives. The situation on Zombie Island was as complex as it came. Only after the reveal of all this information do you realize that the same ghost trying to help the gang with the warning to leave was also a mass murderer. Some of the zombies that aided and thanked the gang were Confederate soldiers, men who fought for the right to own people through slavery. The conflict that the Mystery Gang had to overcome was so impactful because of all of this background. The villains weren't greedy because they were greedy or bad because they were bad. They were given justifiable reasons that, while not agreeable, were understandable. Simone and Lena were two women that experienced horrible trauma, but then became the very thing that they once hated: mass murderers. Zombie Island's greatest strength, by far, is taking this concept of monsters being real and not shying away from telling a genuine story of struggle and loss with it. Zombie Island's high critical acclaim isn't just based in the execution of a unique Scooby-Doo mystery. The reason so many people liked Zombie Island is because the writing of its story appealed to both kids and their parents. Children loved the funny wackiness, but adults then and now love the intense story that the well-crafted, brutally honest conflict created. And while kids are certainly the target audience for animation, there is certainly something to be said for creating animation that adults can enjoy too.
Well, you know, primarily children watch cartoons, but adults watch cartoons too. In fact, in the evening, on the average evening, more adults are tuned to the Cartoon Network than are tuned to CNN.
Thank you guys so much for watching all the way to the end. I know this was a longer and honestly different type of video than what I usually put out, so please let me know if you like this first installment of the Throwback Breakdown series, because if you do, I will be happy to continue making more in the future. And if you really like what you heard, subscribe to the channel and sign up to Patreon to get some great benefits. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.